I always thought my life was relatively normal, one of those where you don't expect major twists and turns, you know? Until that day. It was a sunny Tuesday, but I was trapped in the maternity ward, utterly exhausted after what felt like an endless labor. The birth of my first child was supposed to be the happiest moment of my life, and in some ways it was. But something felt off. From the moment I heard his first cry, I felt an inexplicable pang in my chest, as if something was out of place. It was such a strange feeling that even the joy of holding my baby for the first time couldn't dispel it. When the nurse placed my son in my arms, something immediately caught my attention: his eyes. They weren't like mine or my husband's. They were such a deep, crystalline blue that they seemed to reflect the sky on the clearest day imaginable. I froze. It wasn't just the color, there was something hypnotic, almost supernatural, about his gaze. I looked around, expecting someone to comment, but everyone was too busy, nurses adjusting equipment, my husband telling me how proud he was. I could only think, this doesn't make sense. Things started to get strange when I overheard a whisper between two nurses. They were in a corner of the room, murmuring something that seemed urgent, but they kept glancing at me and the baby. "Does this happen often?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The younger nurse gave an awkward smile and replied in a tone that clearly didn't convince me, "Sometimes it's just a genetic variation." But the older nurse looked directly at me and murmured something that sent chills down my spine. "I've never seen anything like it." That was the moment the first spark of panic ignited within me. When my husband returned from the waiting room, I was already on the verge of collapse. He walked over to see the baby, and the second he laid eyes on him, his expression changed. It was subtle, but I knew him too well not to notice. First, a slight furrowing of his brow, then his eyes widened just a fraction. He tried to mask it with a smile, but it was too late. "Did you notice his eyes?" I asked, my voice nearly breaking. He hesitated, the kind of silence that says more than words. Finally he responded, "Yeah, they're different, aren't they?" From there, things only got worse. As I was wheeled to my room, I noticed the hospital staff stairs following us down the hallway. They tried not to look directly, but it was impossible to ignore. Those eyes drew attention like beacons in the dark. Once we arrived, the pediatrician came in to do routine exams. She observed the baby for a few seconds, then left without saying anything. When she returned, she brought a man who introduced himself as the hospital's geneticist. My heart sank. I knew something was wrong, but I could never have imagined just how much this story would change my life. I couldn't get out of my mind what was happening at the hospital. But as I tried to organize my thoughts, memories of Miguel and how our story began started to surface. I met him at university, on an ordinary day I never imagined would be so significant. He was sitting at the back of the classroom with a reserved attitude that made him almost invisible. He wasn't exactly shy, but there was something about him that screamed discomfort. He had just switched majors, and the feeling of being out of place seemed to permeate his every move. I, always too curious for my own good, decided to introduce myself. Something in his gaze, calm yet slightly lost, made me feel like he needed an extended hand. At first, Miguel spoke little. He listened more than he participated, but little by little, he began to open up. I started inviting him to lunch with my group, making up reasons for him to interact with others. I remember once convincing him to join a group activity for a project, and he was so nervous that he spilled coffee all over the papers. Everyone laughed, and for the first time, I saw him truly relax and smile. It was a shy smile, but so genuine it took me by surprise. "Thanks for not giving up on me," he said at the end of the semester, and I just shrugged, pretending it didn't mean much to me. But it did. Over time, Miguel began to fit in. It wasn't long before he was being invited to parties and gatherings he once only watched from afar. Sometimes, I'd see him talking with others and feel strangely proud, as if I had been part of that transformation. What I didn't realize back then was that Miguel always gravitated toward me more than anyone else. He was discreet but constantly found reasons to ask for my help, whether it was to review an assignment or ask something trivial. "You seem to know everything," he'd say, and I'd laugh, never imagining he was just looking for excuses to be near me. When I graduated, I thought our lives would follow different paths. He still had 2 more years, and I was focused on starting my career. That's when he surprised me. One day, he showed up at the library where I was preparing for job interviews. He was holding an old book and looked nervous. "I need to tell you something," he began, stumbling over his words. Then, almost breathless, he said, "I like you, Sophia. I want us to go out. But only if you want to. Only if it doesn't interfere with your plans." I didn't know what to say. He gave a hesitant smile and added, "When you get the job you want, I'll be here, waiting for you." That moment changed everything. I'll never forget the way he said it, with a mix of bravery and vulnerability that left me stunned. Miguel wasn't the type to make impulsive declarations. He planned everything, overthought before acting. That's why it caught me off guard. But deep down, I knew I felt something for him too. He was different from anyone I'd ever met, genuine, kind, and able to make me feel special without saying a word. I promised him that once I got the job, we'd give us a chance. And that's exactly what happened. After graduating, I was filled with confidence, almost as if I had the world in my hands. I believed my dedication in college and internships would be enough to open the doors to my dreams. But reality was a cold shower. My resume, which I thought was impeccable, didn't seem to impress anyone. I was rejected from so many jobs I lost count. Each, unfortunately, email felt like a blow to my pride. For the first time in my life, I faced the feeling of not being good enough, and I'll admit, it hurt more than I expected. Miguel was there the entire time. He comforted me with his calm demeanor, saying it was only a matter of time before something good came along. But to me, it sounded empty. Like words you say because you don't know what else to offer. Until one day, almost out of desperation, I accepted a position at a small company, far from what I dreamed of. It wasn't exactly in my field, but it offered stability and an opportunity to learn new things. Miguel, of course, celebrated as if I'd been named CEO. "It's just the beginning, Sophia. Every great story starts like this," he said, taking my hands with a look of unwavering belief. The routine at work was exhausting and often demotivating. The environment was nothing like I had envisioned, with a team that seemed to be there out of sheer obligation. But little by little, I began to notice hidden opportunities. I got involved in side projects, trying to prove I was more than just an average employee. That's how my boss, a strict man named Mr. Augusto, began to notice my potential. He was the kind of person who rarely gave praise, but when he did, you knew you had achieved something meaningful. It was he who suggested I consider pursuing a postgraduate degree to enhance my skills. The idea of going back to school while working scared me at first, but Miguel encouraged me. He said I was capable of achieving anything and promised to be by my side every step of the way. So, I enrolled and began juggling work and studies. There were nights when I barely slept, balancing deadlines at work with endless readings for class. But, incredibly, it gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if I was finally building something meaningful. Miguel celebrated every milestone as if it were his own. When I completed my first major project at work, he showed up at my house with a small bottle of champagne and a box of chocolates. "You're growing, Sophia. You're building something amazing," he said, his eyes sparkling with pride. I'll never forget how that made me feel. No matter how small the victory seemed to me, he always made it feel monumental. At 25, I wasn't where I wanted to be yet, but I felt like I was on the right path. And with Miguel by my side, it was impossible not to believe that everything would turn out fine in the end. When Miguel finally proposed at 29, it felt like everything was falling into place. He made the proposal in such a typical Miguel way, simple, sincere, and full of love. He took me to our favorite cafe, the one where we'd spent countless hours talking about everything and nothing, and pulled out a small ring from his pocket. "I don't want a life without you, Sophia," he said, looking straight into my eyes. Of course, I said yes. And as the people around us clapped, all I could think was how lucky I was to have found someone like him. Our families were ecstatic with the news. My mom was already planning the invitations, my dad wanted to help with the flowers, and Miguel's parents seemed thrilled to officially welcome me into the family. But I soon realized that not everything would be as perfect as it seemed. During family lunches, I started noticing a strange dynamic. Miguel's mom, Anna, was always the first to serve the food and the last to sit down. There was always something for her to do, a task, a subtle criticism from Aunt Helena, or an order given without any courtesy. I wondered how she endured it all without ever complaining. Helena, in particular, was difficult. She carried herself with an air of superiority, as if the world owed her deference, speaking loudly and treating Anna as though she were some sort of personal servant. Once, during dinner, Helena complained that the roast was dry and cast a disapproving look at Anna, as if it were her fault. It made me deeply uncomfortable. I don't know what came over me, but I found myself speaking up. At least someone here made the effort to cook. And honestly, it's delicious. The silence that followed was deafening. Miguel looked at me with a mix of surprise and pride, but Helena glared at me with daggers in her eyes. From that day on, I knew I had stepped into dangerous territory. Helena started picking on me whenever she could. If I helped Anna with the dishes, she'd say things like, "Oh look, trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law." If I stayed quiet, she'd say I was too full of myself to help. It felt like walking through a minefield, but I didn't regret it. Anna seemed lighter when I was around, and sometimes, after everyone left, she'd quietly thank me. "You're so strong, Sophia," she'd say. "I wish I had half your courage." Despite the tensions with Helena, Miguel's support never wavered. He defended me whenever necessary and made it clear to his family that our relationship was his priority. "You don't have to face this alone," he'd say. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but something in me believed we were building something solid, something bigger than the challenges. As we prepared for the wedding, I saw Anna smile more times than I could count, as if my presence had awakened something in her. And although Helena's provocations continued, I decided that protecting this incredible woman would be part of my life from then on. After all, what is family if not a team that supports one another, even in the hardest times? Not long after our honeymoon, the questions began to surface as casually as small talk about the weather. Except instead of, "Do you think it'll rain today?" it was always, "When are the kids coming?" At first, I thought it was just curiosity. But over time, I realized it was much more than that. Miguel's grandmother, Dona Teresa, seemed especially intent on reminding us at every family gathering that the biological clock doesn't wait. With every comment, she'd throw pointed looks at me, as if not catching the hint was a personal offense. Helena, of course, seized every opportunity to fuel the conversation. "I already had 2 kids by your age," she said during one lunch, cutting her chicken with the precision of someone slicing through someone's hopes. "You young people these days are so selfish, only thinking about your careers." Miguel tried to intervene, saying that having children was our decision and that we'd do so in our own time. But no one seemed to listen. Even Anna, who had always been my ally, didn't escape the pressure. She began repeating lines like, "I just want to see my grandchildren before I get too old." Or, "Maybe you should try some teas to help." That's when things started spiraling out of control. Anna, in her attempts to help, began believing everything she heard about fertility methods. She showed up at our house with bottles of bitter tea that promised miracles, and even small charms that she claimed would attract baby energy. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Anna, is this really necessary?" I asked, trying not to sound rude. She responded with a sincerity that broke my heart. "I just want to help, Sophia. I want you to have everything you wish for." The pressure didn't let up, and it began to take a toll on us. Every family gathering seemed to revolve around the same topic. Comments about how sad it would be if the family didn't grow, or jokes about who would be to blame if children didn't come. These conversations made me increasingly anxious, and I noticed Miguel was also starting to feel the weight. He never said it outright, but I could tell from the way he squeezed my hand under the table, as if saying, "I'm with you, but this is hard for me too." The pressure reached its peak during a dinner at Helena's house. Dona Teresa brought up an old family superstition, a blessed pillow that was supposed to be placed on the bed to attract fertility. When Helena handed it to me, smiling as if offering the Holy Grail, something inside me snapped. I just couldn't hold it in anymore. If I decide to have children, it will be when I'm ready, not because of some magic pillow. My voice was louder than I intended. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Miguel held me afterward, whispering, "You did what you had to do." But at that moment, all I felt was the crushing weight of expectations that weren't even mine. When I discovered I was pregnant at 29, it felt like a storm of emotions hit me all at once. On one hand, I felt an indescribable joy seeing the positive pregnancy test. On the other, anxiety and fear began to grow inside me. Will I be a good mother? Am I really ready? These questions echoed in my mind, even as Miguel, beaming, hugged me and said, "Everything will be fine, Sophia. We did it." But soon, the joy gave way to the challenges of pregnancy. The nausea began early, and I could barely eat without feeling sick. The weeks dragged on, and each day seemed harder than the last. In the second trimester, things didn't improve much. It felt like my body was rebelling against me. I gained weight uncontrollably, my skin broke out with blemishes, and the back pain made me wonder if I could even make it to the end of the pregnancy. Miguel did everything he could to help, from cooking meals to staying up with me on sleepless nights. But the external pressure didn't let up. "Now you're doing the right thing," Dona Teresa would say whenever she could. Helena, of course, didn't miss a chance to give unsolicited advice. "You should walk more, Sophia. It's good for the baby. And maybe you wouldn't gain so much weight." Every comment felt like a thorn, but I tried not to let it get to me. Finally, the day of the birth arrived. We were at the hospital, surrounded by family. My parents, Miguel, Dona Teresa, Helena, and even Anna, who seemed more nervous than I was. The contractions were long and painful, but after hours of effort, I heard my baby cry for the first time. It was Lucas. The emotion of holding that tiny being in my arms was indescribable. He was perfect, so small and fragile, yet full of life. Miguel was by my side, tears in his eyes, whispering, "He's beautiful, Sophia. Our little boy." But then, something happened. As the nurses cleaned Lucas and performed the exams, I noticed murmurs among them. It was as if they were discussing something they didn't want me to hear. One of them looked at me and asked, "Your husband is also Latino, right?" Confused, I confirmed and asked what was going on. The nurse hesitated before showing me something I never expected to see. Lucas's eyes were such a bright, deep blue that they reflected the light in the room. My heart raced. "Is this normal?" I asked, my voice trembling. The nurse just shrugged and said, "It's uncommon, but it happens." When Miguel saw Lucas for the first time, he froze. He looked at the baby, then at me, as if searching for words but finding none. The silence in the room was unbearable. It didn't take long before the comments began. "Who does he get those eyes from? Or are you sure there's no distant relative with light eyes?" Dona Teresa, who had been so excited, frowned. Helena gave me a look I'll never forget, full of doubt and accusation. "It's genetic, right?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I knew I was about to face a storm, but at that moment, all I could do was hold Lucas close and think, "He's mine. And nothing will change that." The days following Lucas's birth, which should have been filled with joy, turned into a nightmare. Miguel started acting differently. He didn't say anything outright, but his silences were deafening. At night, when Lucas cried and I rocked him to sleep, I could feel Miguel's gaze on me, but it wasn't the loving look I knew. It was cold, almost analytical. "Do you think this is normal?" he asked one night, gesturing toward Lucas's eyes. The question sounded innocent, but his tone was loaded with insinuation. My heart sank. He was beginning to doubt me. Helena and Dona Teresa made things worse. Every time they visited, they'd drop venomous comments, often disguised as concern. "You know, my friend Maria had a similar surprise." In her case, it turned out the baby wasn't her husband's, Helena said with a fake smile. Even Anna, who had always been my ally, seemed unsure. "Sophia, are you sure this isn't a mistake? Maybe some distant genetic trait?" she asked gently, but her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I felt like everyone around me was judging me, as if I were guilty of something I couldn't even comprehend. The breaking point came when Miguel asked to talk. We sat on the living room couch, and after hesitating for a long time, he finally said what had been on his mind. "I think we need to do a DNA test, Sophia. Just to put all doubts to rest." It was like a knife to the heart. "Are you saying you don't trust me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He tried to justify it, saying it was because of the family's pressure and that it would be good to put an end to the speculation. But to me, it was clear, he was judging me too. The man I loved and had built a life with now looked at me as if I were a stranger. Even my parents were not my refuge. When I told them about the DNA test, my father, Joao, frowned. Sophia, are you sure there isn't something we should know? My mother, Marta, tried to soften things. Honey, we know you'd never do something like that, but maybe it's best to clear everything up. My world collapsed. The two people who should have known me better than anyone were, even implicitly, questioning my integrity. In that moment, I felt more alone than ever. All I wanted was to protect Lucas, but it seemed like no one was on my side. The days leading up to the DNA test results were torture. I was treated like a criminal, as if I needed to prove my innocence. Miguel barely spoke to me, and I avoided looking him in the eye, afraid of seeing more doubt. When the results finally arrived, we all gathered at the hospital. Me, Miguel, our parents, even Helena and Dona Teresa. It felt like a courtroom, everyone waiting for the verdict. The doctor opened the envelope and announced, "The test confirms, with 99.99% certainty, that Miguel is the biological father." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at each face, waiting for an apology, but all I saw was shame. Finally, I could breathe again. But in that moment, I realized something had changed within me forever. Though my innocence was proven, the pain of their mistrust would never fully go away. The doctor explained that Lucas's blue eyes were the result of a rare genetic mutation. Something possible, though extremely unusual, in families of Latino origin. He mentioned it was caused by specific variations in genes responsible for melanin production. But for me, it wasn't about the science. It was about trust. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The relief of having my innocence confirmed was there, but so was the sting of betrayal. It wasn't just Miguel, it was everyone who had judged me, whispered behind my back, doubted me. When we left the hospital, the air was heavy with an odd silence. Miguel tried to take my hand, but I pulled away. It wasn't the time. He tried to speak, "Sophia, but I didn't want to hear it." "Not now, Miguel," I said, and he didn't insist. The walk to the car was slow and tense. Helena and Dona Teresa stayed behind, whispering to each other, likely crafting a new theory to justify the unjustifiable. Anna looked devastated. She glanced at me with tears in her eyes, but said nothing. Perhaps she understood that no words could mend what had been broken. When we got home, Miguel finally broke down. "Sophia, forgive me. I should have trusted you. Deep down, I knew this was impossible, but I let them get in my head." He seemed genuinely remorseful, but his words felt hollow in that moment. "Do you know what hurts the most, Miguel? It wasn't their doubt, it was yours," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He had no response. He just lowered his head, defeated. I still loved Miguel, but I also knew our relationship would never be the same. There was a crack that would take a long time to heal. Helena continued her campaign of insinuations, though now more subtly. "It's rare, but not impossible, right? Science doesn't explain everything," she remarked during a family lunch a few weeks later. I pretended not to hear. Miguel, however, stood up, took Lucas in his arms, and said, "If you don't have anything useful to say, maybe it's better to stay quiet." It was the first time I'd seen him truly defend me against Helena, but by then, I had learned something important. I didn't need anyone's approval. Lucas was my son, and I would protect him with everything I had. The DNA test brought answers, but it also left scars. For me, it was clear that some of those scars would never fully heal. A few weeks later, Anna called me unexpectedly. Her voice was tense but urgent. "Sophia, can you come with me to visit my great-aunt Carmen? I need to introduce her to Lucas." I was taken aback. I'd heard of Dona Carmen, a 92-year-old woman who lived in an old house in a rural area, but I never imagined she'd be part of this story. I hesitated for a moment but agreed. There was something in Anna's tone that piqued my curiosity, as if she knew something she couldn't explain over the phone. We arrived at Dona Carmen's house on a cloudy afternoon, with Lucas sleeping in my arms. The house was simple, with creaky wooden windows and a garden overgrown with herbs and wildflowers. When the door opened, we were greeted by a woman whose features were sharp but worn by time. Dona Carmen's eyes sparkled with life, as though she carried more stories than one lifetime could hold. The moment she saw Lucas, her eyes widened, and she covered her mouth with her hand. "Oh my God! He has Alberto's eyes," she exclaimed, overcome with emotion. I froze. Alberto? I asked, trying to piece things together. Anna, who had been restless until then, finally broke her silence. Alberto was my grandfather, Sofia. He had blue eyes, just like Lucas. My heart started to race. So there was an explanation, a long-lost family trait no one had considered. Dona Carmen continued, her voice trembling with emotion. Alberto was special, you know? His eyes always drew attention, and my mother used to say they were a distant inheritance from Europe. It caused a lot of trouble for my family back then because people spread rumors, thinking my mother had betrayed her husband. It was like hearing an echo of what I had just lived through. The revelation weighed heavily on Anna. She looked at me with a mix of guilt and relief. I didn't know, or maybe I'd forgotten, she murmured. But Dona Carmen was determined to set the record straight. It's not your fault, Anna. These old stories get lost, but blood doesn't lie. I looked at Lucas, now awake and gazing at me with those bright, captivating eyes. It felt as if the weight of generations had been placed on the shoulders of a baby who couldn't even speak yet. For the first time in weeks, I felt a massive burden lift from my chest. The explanation we'd been missing was finally clear and simple. We returned home with a mix of emotions. I felt relieved to finally have an answer, but I couldn't forget everything that had happened. When Miguel heard the story, he remained silent for a long time before saying, "I'll never forgive myself for doubting you." Anna seemed changed after the visit to Dona Carmen. She became more protective of me and Lucas, almost as if trying to make up for what had happened. As for Helena and Dona Teresa, they didn't say much afterward, but their critical stares disappeared. Knowing that Lucas's eyes were a gift from his ancestry felt like the closing of a painful chapter. Finally, the constant speculation came to an end. 3 years have passed since that tumultuous start, and much has changed in our lives. Miguel and I decided to distance ourselves from family tensions and focus on what truly matters, our own family. It wasn't an easy decision, but after everything we went through, it became clear that our well-being, and that of our children, had to come first. Anna also found her own path. After decades of enduring disrespect, she finally divorced and returned to her hometown, where she says she has found a peace she never had before. And Helena and Dona Teresa? They are now part of the past, along with the wounds they caused. The arrival of Isabella marked a new chapter for our family. When she was born, her eyes were dark, but there was something different about them, a subtle sparkle that seemed to dance in the light. Miguel joked, "I think we've got another rare inheritance here." Isabella brought a fresh sense of lightness to our home, as though she had come to heal some of the scars from the past. Lucas, with his now famous blue eyes, became a loving and protective older brother despite his young age. He held her as if he were guarding something precious, and their connection filled me with pride. That said, not everything has been easy. Lucas still draws curious stares and intrusive questions when we're in public. Whose eyes did he get? People often ask, usually without malice but unaware of the impact their words can have. He's still too young to understand, but Miguel and I worry about the future. What kind of prejudice will he face at school, at work, in the world? We try to create an environment where he feels safe and loved, but we know we can't shield him from everything. Our hope is that when the time comes, he'll have the strength to face it. Sometimes Miguel and I reflect on how much this experience has changed us. He still carries guilt for doubting me, but I try to reassure him. "Miguel, what matters is that we're together and we learned from this." Our relationship emerged stronger from that storm, though not without scars. We've learned to be more honest and open with each other and to cherish the simple things. Like Lucas's laughter as he runs through the garden or the way Isabella sleeps curled up in our arms. We don't need anyone's approval to know the value of what we've built together. Now, at 32 and 34 years old, we think about the kind of world we want for our children. Above all, we hope they grow up in a place that celebrates differences rather than questioning them. When I look at Lucas and Isabella, I see the future. 2 children carrying not just our stories, but also the promise of something greater. And although the past was painful, I feel gratitude. Gratitude for my family, for overcoming the challenges, and for finally finding peace in the chaos.